Belfast, Northern Ireland, June 21st, 1978. Ulster Hall. British Army Corporal James McAllister, 23 years old, stood in full combat gear at the back of the concert venue, assigned to security detail for Bob Marley's performance during one of the bloodiest years of the Troubles. James had killed 7 men in 3 years of urban warfare patrolling Belfast streets, and every single face haunted his sleep with accusations his commanding officers told him to ignore. What happened when Bob Marley locked eyes with James during war and then found him crying backstage 2 hours later would cost James his military career, 18 months of freedom in military prison, and everything he thought defined his identity, but it would also give him a purpose that would eventually help end 3 separate wars in countries he'd never heard of before that night. James McAllister had joined the British Army at age 20 with romantic notions about serving Queen and country, defending freedom, and being part of something larger than his small-town Scottish upbringing could offer. The reality of military service in Northern Ireland during the Troubles had stripped away those illusions with brutal efficiency. By 1978, James had spent 3 years patrolling Belfast streets, where every corner could hide a sniper, every parked car could be a bomb, and every civilian could be an enemy combatant or an innocent bystander. And telling the difference often came down to split-second decisions that ended with someone dead. James had made those decisions 7 times. 7 confirmed kills in 3 years. His commanding officers praised his discipline and accuracy. His fellow soldiers respected his calm under fire. His psychological evaluations showed no signs of post-traumatic stress that would require him to be pulled from active duty. But alone in his barracks at night, James counted faces. 7 men he'd killed following orders in a conflict he no longer understood, fighting for political objectives that changed depending on which politician was speaking, in a war that had no clear victory condition except maybe everyone eventually getting tired of killing each other. When James received orders to provide security at Bob Marley's concert at Ulster Hall on June 21st, he didn't know who Bob Marley was. Just another assignment in a city where concerts were rare because violence made large gatherings dangerous. Security detail meant standing in the back wearing full combat gear with a rifle, scanning the crowd for threats, making sure no paramilitary groups used the event to stage an attack. Standard procedure in Belfast, 1978. James arrived at Ulster Hall 3 hours before doors opened for final security sweep. Checked exits, identified sight lines, coordinated with local police, established communication protocols, professional and thorough. But when Bob Marley's crew arrived for sound check and James heard the music drifting through the venue for the first time, something in those rhythms bypassed his military training and touched a part of himself he'd been suppressing for 3 years. The concert began at 7:30 p.m. 2,000 people packed into Ulster Hall, Catholics and Protestants, sitting together for one night, temporarily unified by music in a city torn apart by sectarian violence. James stood at his assigned position in the back corner, rifle at ready position, eyes scanning the crowd with trained vigilance, but his ears couldn't help absorbing the music. The messages in Bob's lyrics about unity, love, and ending division felt like they were being sung directly into the bleeding wound James carried in his chest where his conscience used to live. Then Bob began performing War, his adaptation of Haile Selassie's speech condemning racism and calling for human equality. The lyrics hit James like physical blows. Until the philosophy which holds one race superior and another inferior is finally and permanently discredited and abandoned, everywhere is war. James's hands tightened on his rifle. He was standing in full combat gear inside a concert venue in Belfast because one group of white Christians believed they were superior to another group of white Christians, and both sides were willing to kill over that belief. Bob's eyes swept across the crowd and locked onto James standing in the back corner in British Army uniform with rifle. For just a moment, maybe 3 seconds, maybe 5, Bob held James's gaze while singing about war and the philosophies that perpetuate it. James felt something crack inside his chest. Bob wasn't accusing him. Bob was seeing him, really seeing him, seeing past the uniform and rifle to the broken young man underneath who'd killed 7 people and couldn't remember anymore why any of those deaths had been necessary. James broke eye contact first, looking down at his boots, blinking rapidly against tears that soldiers aren't supposed to cry while on duty. When he looked up again, Bob had moved on, singing to the rest of the crowd, but James knew something fundamental had shifted in those few seconds of connection. The concert ended around 10 p.m. James's duty required him to remain until the venue cleared and Bob's crew finished loading equipment. Standard security protocol. But as the crowd filed out and James maintained his post, he felt the carefully constructed walls he'd built around his emotions beginning to collapse. By 10:30 p.m., the main hall was empty except for crew members breaking down equipment. James's commanding officer released him from duty, telling him to report back to barracks. James started walking toward the exit, made it about 20 feet, then stopped, turned around, walked backstage without really knowing why. Later, he would say he felt pulled by something stronger than military discipline or common sense. He found a quiet corner behind the stage equipment cases, set down his rifle, and sat on the floor with his back against the wall. And for the first time since joining the military 3 years earlier, James McAllister allowed himself to feel the full weight of what he'd done in service to a conflict he didn't understand. He cried. Not quiet tears, but body-shaking sobs that he tried to muffle with his hands, because even in breakdown, he was terrified of being caught showing weakness. That's when Bob Marley found him. Bob had been talking with crew members about the next tour stop when he heard someone crying. He walked around the equipment cases and saw a British soldier in full combat gear sitting on the floor weeping like a child. Bob didn't hesitate, walked over and sat down beside James without asking permission. James looked up, saw Bob Marley sitting next to him, and felt fresh shame flooding through him. "I'm sorry, I shouldn't be here. I'll leave." Bob put a hand on James's shoulder. "Stay. You're exactly where you need to be." They sat in silence for nearly a minute, James trying to control his crying, Bob waiting patiently with a stillness that felt like the opposite of military tension. Finally, Bob spoke. "What's your name, soldier?" James McAllister." "How old are you, James?" 23. Bob nodded slowly. "How long have you been in Northern Ireland?" 3 years. Another long pause. Then Bob asked the question that would change James's life forever. "How many men have you killed for someone else's war?" James felt like he'd been shot. Not metaphorically, he literally felt impact in his chest, like a bullet had pierced through his body armor and exploded his heart. His mouth opened, but no sound came out initially. Then, 7 confirmed kills. "Were they soldiers or civilians?" James's voice cracked. "I don't know anymore. They told us they were combatants, threats, targets, but they were somebody's sons, somebody's fathers, and I killed them because someone with more rank than me said they needed to die." Bob's next question was even quieter. "Do you believe they needed to die?" James broke completely. No, I don't. I don't know what I believe anymore, except that I've got 7 faces burned into my memory, and I can't make them go away. And nobody in my unit wants to talk about it, because talking about it means admitting we might be doing something wrong. And if we're doing something wrong, then what the hell are we even here for? Bob let James cry without interruption. When the sobs finally subsided into exhausted breathing, Bob spoke again. "James, can I tell you what I saw when I looked at you during the concert?" James nodded, unable to speak. "I saw a good man trapped in a bad situation. I saw someone's conscience screaming while his training tells him to be silent. I saw a soldier who's forgotten he's also a human being with a soul that knows the difference between right and wrong." James wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, smearing camouflage paint across his face. "My soul is dead. I killed it along with those 7 men. No, brother, your soul isn't dead. That's why you're crying. Dead souls don't weep. Your soul is alive and it's trying to save you from becoming someone you can't live with." They talked for another 90 minutes. Bob asked questions. James answered with an honesty that would have gotten him court-martialed if any superior officer had heard. He talked about his kills, about the 14-year-old boy he shot who turned out to be holding a toy gun, not a real one, about the man he killed who might have been reaching for a weapon or might have been reaching for identification. James had half a second to decide and chose to fire. About the nightmares, about the drinking, about the complete disconnection he felt from the civilians he was supposedly protecting and the enemies he was supposedly fighting. Bob listened to all of it, never judged, never told James he was a monster or a murderer, But he also didn't absolve James or tell him the killing was justified by following orders. Finally, around midnight, Bob asked, "What are you going to do now, James?" "What do you mean?" "You can go back to your barracks tonight and continue being a soldier in a war you don't believe in, killing people you don't hate for reasons you don't understand. Or you can choose something different. Those are your only two options. Stay or leave. Keep killing or stop. Which one lets you live with yourself?" James stared at Bob in disbelief. "Are you telling me to desert?" "I'm not telling you anything. I'm asking what kind of man you want to be when you look in the mirror 10 years from now." Only you can answer that. James's military training screamed at him that desertion was treason, criminal, a betrayal of everyone who'd ever served. But something deeper, the part of him that Bob had identified as his soul, whispered that staying was the real betrayal. Betrayal of the 14-year-old boy with the toy gun. Betrayal of the 7 men whose faces haunted his sleep. Betrayal of whatever remained good inside himself. Bob stood up, preparing to leave. "Whatever you decide, James, know this. The people who started this war, the politicians who keep it going, the officers who give the orders, they sleep fine at night. They're not the ones pulling triggers. You are. You're the one carrying the bodies in your conscience. So the question isn't what they want you to do. The question is what you can live with doing." Bob put his hand on James's shoulder one more time. "War doesn't end because soldiers stop believing in it, James. War ends because soldiers stop fighting it. Someone has to be first. Maybe that's you." Then Bob walked away, leaving James sitting alone in full combat gear behind the stage at Ulster Hall at midnight, with a decision to make that would define the rest of his life. James sat there until 2 a.m. Then he stood up, picked up his rifle, walked out of Ulster Hall, and instead of returning to his barracks Vaux, he walked to the British consulate and turned himself in for desertion. The military justice system moved quickly. James was arrested, charged with desertion during active duty in a combat zone, and court-martialed within 6 weeks. He pled guilty and refused to mount any defense, sentenced to 18 months in military prison, dishonorably discharged, stripped of rank, benefits, and any honor his service might have earned. James served his full sentence at Colchester Military Corrective Training Center. His family disowned him. His former brothers-in-arms called him coward and traitor. Letters from soldiers he'd served with arrived weekly calling him every vile name military culture could devise for someone who broke the warrior code by refusing to fight. James read every letter, accepted every accusation, never defended himself. He'd made his choice, and he was paying the price. The only thing that sustained him through 18 months of prison was remembering Bob's words. Your soul is alive, and it's trying to save you from becoming someone you can't live with. When James was released in January 1980, he was 25 years old with a dishonorable discharge. No job prospects, no family support, and no plan except a bone-deep certainty that he couldn't stay in Britain. He sold everything he owned, bought a one-way ticket to Kingston, Jamaica, and showed up with nothing but a backpack and the memory of a 2-hour conversation that had cost him everything. James spent his first 6 months in Jamaica doing odd jobs and trying to understand why he'd been drawn to this island. The answer came when he started attending peace rallies and community meetings where activists were working to reduce gang violence in Kingston's neighborhoods. James recognized the dynamics: young men being recruited into violent organizations, territorial conflicts, cycles of retaliation that nobody could remember how they started. He began volunteering with peace organizations. At first, he just did manual labor building community centers, painting over gang graffiti, cleaning up neighborhoods. But eventually, organizers learned James's story. British soldier who'd deserted rather than keep killing, who'd gone to prison to save his soul, who'd traveled across the world to find some way to redeem 7 lives he couldn't bring back. They started using him as a speaker at youth intervention programs. James would tell his story to 15-year-olds being recruited by gangs. I killed 7 men following orders I thought were right. Took me 3 years to realize I was wrong. How many years will it take you? How many faces will you carry? Get out now before you become someone you can't forgive. It worked. Young men listened to this white British ex-soldier with scars on his soul talking about consequences and conscience and the weight of killing. Several gang members left their organizations after hearing James speak. Some of them joined the peace work. And James had a secret weapon he'd learned from the man who'd saved him, Bob Marley's music. James started bringing a small battery-powered cassette player to meetings and rallies, would play Bob's songs, especially War and Redemption Song, and watch young men who'd grown hard from street violence begin to soften. The music reached places words couldn't. James had experienced it himself that night at Ulster Hall when Bob's lyrics cracked through his emotional armor. Now he was using the same tool Bob had used on him. By 1985, James had become one of Jamaica's most effective peace activists, despite being a white British immigrant with a criminal military record. His authenticity was undeniable. He'd sacrificed everything, career, family, country, honor, because he'd chosen conscience over obedience. People trusted that. In 1987, the Organization of African Unity invited James to Mozambique to work on post-Civil War reconciliation. James spent 18 months there using the same techniques he'd developed in Jamaica youth intervention, former combatant rehabilitation, and Bob Marley's music as healing tool. The program was credited with reducing post-war violence by 40% in target communities. Similar invitations followed. Liberia in 1994 after their civil war. Sierra Leone in 1999, working with former child soldiers. Uganda in 2003, mediating conflicts in northern regions. Every assignment, James brought Bob's music. Played War for child soldiers who'd been forced to kill. Played One Love for communities torn apart by ethnic violence. Played Redemption Song for people trying to rebuild after atrocity. It worked. Not magic, not miracles, just music that somehow made space for people to remember their humanity underneath their trauma and rage. 40 years after that night at Ulster Hall, James McAllister is 63 years old and still living in Jamaica. He's credited by international peace organizations with contributing to conflict resolution in 3 African countries. He's trained over 200 peace workers in intervention techniques. He's spoken at the United Nations twice about post-conflict reconciliation. And he still carries a photo of Bob Marley in his wallet. Same photo from 1978. Bob on stage at some concert, dreadlocks flying, guitar in hand, mouth open singing Truth to Power. When journalists asked James how a disgraced British soldier became an internationally respected peace activist, he tells them the same story every time. Bob Marley asked me one question. How many men have you killed for someone else's war? That question destroyed me, broke me completely. I went to prison for 18 months because I couldn't live with the answer. But that destruction saved me. Sometimes you have to break before you can heal. Bob knew that. He broke me so I could rebuild myself into someone better. That soul Bob identified in a crying soldier behind the stage in Belfast has spent 40 years trying to save others.